Welcome to the Directors UK podcast. We're the professional association for UK film and TV directors. No matter the format, no matter the genre, our featured directors share their approach to the craft. We hope you enjoy.
Hello, my name is Toyin Ayinde and I'm the Member Engagement and Events Manager at Directors UK. Today, we have director Greg Kwedar in conversation with journalist Robbie Collins on his latest film, Sing Sing. We hope you enjoy their discussion.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I can't wait to talk about this film.
Robbie, thank you so much, and thank you to Directors UK for having me. It's really a privilege to be with you all this evening.
We're working on the basis this evening that everyone has seen the film, so we don't need to worry about spoilers. But on that note, I want to say that the first time I saw Sing Sing, it was up at the Edinburgh Film Festival this year. I had no idea how the film had been put together, specifically about the approach to casting. So when those credits appeared at the end as himself, I almost fell off my seat because I could not. And what I love about it so much is it completely proves the film's thesis at a stroke. You know, the film doesn't need to make a special case for the efficacy or the kind of spiritual, advancement that this practice, the RTA presents these guys with, because it's all on screen. It's there. You've experienced it with them for the last 2 hours. So I absolutely love that. I'm assuming that this casting approach was absolutely baked into the project from the very start. So can you tell us whether it was always going to be a film about the program with this casting approach, or were you looking at doing various films with these guys, and then this seemed to be the most logical way in which it could take place?
That's a great question. I'll give just a little bit of context into, our first awareness of the immense talent pool available from alumni of this theater program called Rehabilitated Through the Arts. But I came across the program quite unexpectedly. I was producing a short documentary inside of a maximum security prison in Kansas, and it was my first time ever behind the walls of a prison. And we were doing a film about something else, but on a tour of the facility, I passed by a cell, and inside that cell, there was a young man raising a rescue dog inside of his cell. And it just stopped me in my tracks because it upended all my expectations of prison and incarcerated people that were largely built on the movies I grew up watching, my own industry. And yet here inside of the cell, I was witnessing something decidedly different. I was seeing healing that was happening in both directions between this man and this animal. I was seeing compassion, care, and I was just desperate to know, was there anyone else out there doing things differently? And so that night in the hotel room, I literally typed that into Google, who is doing things differently in prison? And near the top of the search field was this program in New York, Rehabilitation Through the Arts, that had been putting on plays since 1996 inside of Sing Sing. They had done all the classics. They've been covered in a lot of major press, but there was an Esquire article I read that night about a 2005 production of a time-traveling musical comedy called Breaking the Mummy's Code. And I was just like, what is that? That is amazing. It was the playfulness of the piece, the joy in the process juxtaposed against the environment it was set within, that there's something I was yearning for that sensation myself, and so I reached out to the real life Brent Buell, who was the theater teacher who wrote this play, and we had this long conversation. He was like, if you want to understand the story, come to New York, come to my apartment. I'm going to invite some of my friends over for breakfast and you'll see for yourself. And so that first breakfast, this was 8.5 years ago, several of the men who are now in this film were there that morning. The real Clarence Divine I. Macklin was the first man through the door. The real Divine G was the next guy through the door, And we had this conversation around the table that was just so open, warm, funny, and it was like, if we could just capture that feeling, how good this room feels, and put that on a screen, we have something special, which was because of the people there. I mean, you just felt first of all, Divine I mean, I felt like when he walked through the door, I was like, that's a movie star, as soon as he came in the room, so I knew that these alumni should be featured somehow within the film. It was very early. That was a very early recognition. but with time, that confidence just grew. It was like not just a feature, but this is actually needs to be like the core lifeblood and sort of essence and focus of the film needs to kind of come from within, and that came with time.
Mm-hmm. I love that your reaction scene to by now was that not only that he's, you know, an interesting guy, he's got a great story to tell, but that he himself is a movie star. Because
Yeah.
I was struck so much by these guys' faces specifically in this film. You know, you photograph so kind of lovingly and attentively, and you do, I think. I mean, we can talk about cinematography in a little bit, but there's elevation going on there, right? But what was the quality that made you think of him as a movie star? I will say, as a viewer, not knowing who he was, I was racking my brain to think, what else have I seen
Right.
this guy in? Because he seems so at home on the screen.
Yeah, what makes someone a star? That's, you know, it's like it's something that's hard to describe, but you know it when you see it, you know? And I think there's a magnetism, a charisma, but that's not it alone. You know, he has immense depth and you know, like when you look into someone's eyes and you feel like there's a very deep well that you're never going to reach the bottom of, I think that's also something captivating about like great performers is it's not all there. It's not all accessible. But what is, you're just desperate for more of. And I think he also has this, he can distill so many experiences from his life into his own like very unique vernacular and form of poetry, you know, that's also like so intriguing and meaningful.
So my initial thought, had I had that experience that you had 8.5 years ago, was let's put this together into documentary. How do we get these guys sitting down in front of a camera, talking directly to the viewer about their experiences? Why? I mean, did you toy with going that route for a while, or did you want to see them acting, even as themselves, but acting on camera?
You know, it never really occurred to us. You know, even though I kind of came up in documentary filmmaking and you know derived a lot of purpose from that, and I think it very much influences the work I do as a narrative filmmaker. But narrative filmmaking is maybe the way I most closely can come to understanding things about the world is through fiction. You know, and then this movie itself is kind of a mystery to me because it harnesses a lot of mediums together, you know, and you know, we have true narrative filmmaking, we have elements of the stage, we also have unscripted, you know, truly unscripted moments within it. That was always that felt right, you know, as we worked on the project. But the mystery was like, would it work together? You know, would this all like sort of find harmony? You know, that was something we just had to trust that those intentions would lead us somewhere. But you know, there's something about I think performance characters, you know, being able to translate real experiences into scenes and using dramaturgy and all that I think help you access these nuances that kind of probe into hopefully again deeper understanding. But I think a word that we've sort of used throughout this whole journey was sort of alchemy, you know, what happens in the exchange of things, you know, because I think that if we were to do this as like just a truly fictional adaptation, I think something would have been lost from this, just as you said, like even in the credits of the film, as himself, as himself, as himself, like there are things in this movie that could not have been written but only lived, and that becomes part of its transcendence. But then there are things that could not have just been lived; they had to have been performed and mined. You know, like sort of in some of the moments of you know Coleman Domingo, you know, and what he can do through performance and even just within his face, even without words. And so I think all of it matters, and all of it was sort of necessary to finally find our way through this story.
So let me take you back to your point there about this kind of dichotomy between what's written and what's lived and the different things you can bring to the film. How did you go about alchemizing those in the writing process? I mean, did this even have a conventional screenplay, or did you write in a different way in order to bring these different elements in, or or were you interviewing these guys and kind of transcribing their experiences in order to script them? How did that side work?
Well, part of why this took 8.5 years was it was a lot took a long time to figure out the script itself, and it was about 6 years of development. And we tried a lot of things. We really swung across a pendulum. We always sort of thought that, and always knew like the production of Breaking the Mummy's Code was going to be like part of the, architecture and thrust of the movie. But then within that, like what character stories are you telling? And that's really where we weren't sure where to focus. And so the first thing we did, we tried to just do all of it. It was this big, broad ensemble, and there was no clear protagonist. And in the net of that, it was just too narrow, or it was too broad. There wasn't anyone to attach to. And so then we swung to the complete opposite end of the spectrum and did like a very tight point of view, single protagonist, one person's journey from the outside of the program and through the program to the other side. And that was too narrow because it's really the story of a community. And I think the final breakthrough for us was this realization that it should be the story of a friendship. These two men who couldn't have been more different from each other, two real guys, Divine I and Divine G, that we met at that breakfast 8.5 years ago and had continued to know over all these years, and following the arc of their friendship and where they meet each other and what they needed from the program, and within that of like, because of this environment and because of this program, they were able to become like closer than family in the end. And that just felt like something we could attach to. It's sort of simple on the surface, but it has a very deep current that then around that, the kind of chaos of putting on a show, these other stories from the men, they could all sort of be in service of that core idea. And the way we sort of put that together, initially, we would have a lot of research we were doing through conversation with a lot of the alumni, volunteers of the program. The real Brent Beal was very accessible to us with his diaries of all this time, teaching. And then Clint and I, my creative partner, Clint Bentley, and I, we actually became volunteers ourselves, and we actually taught in this program. We became, really intimately involved in teaching class. And every time we would do this, we would come away and do it ourselves, like go write our script. And it always just sort of felt like an imitation of the magic that was happening in these rooms. We never could recapture it on our own. And when we finally had this breakthrough of the friendship story between Divine I and Divine G, it was also came with a recognition that if we were ever going to capture the spirit of this community, our process needed to be reflective of that. We needed to work as a community in the filmmaking process in order to translate the magic of what was happening inside this community. And so we invited the real Divine I and Divine G into the storytelling process with us. And immediately it was alive in a way it never had been for us on the page. And we just continued to open that circle. When Coleman Domingo joined, he joined because there was an openness to be able to bring all of himself and help really shape his own character and build the script alongside of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to quickly skip back to something that you spoke about, script architecture, and especially in kind of structuring it around the show. There is a fictional archetype there, the putting on a show movie. Mm-hmm. I think the other kind of archetype that you're working within is, of course, the prison break movie. Although, of course, the escape here is artistic. It's not
right.
Tunnel. It's escape through art, and it's escape through working around the system's cruelties and unfairnesses in order to get the paperwork through and get out when you should be. But did you refer to any fictional films in either of those traditions?
We're not really looking to the canon of prison films as we were developing it because, again, we didn't want to inherit many of sort of some of the stereotypes that these films, as a body of films, had been, perpetuating. A movie that really struck me, kind of really almost as the idea came, was actually One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Mm-hmm. Felt really spiritually connected to to this work, but it was like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest meets like a Michel Gondry film, like Be Kind, Rewind, you know? It was somewhere in that space that I think that this movie exists. You know, and then right before production, I think I had never seen it, but I watched for the first time Steve McQueen's Hunger, and there are moments in that film that really I felt like also struck a chord to things that we were reaching for. Most notably, um, the moment of Michael Fassbender sticking his hand out the cell and a snowflake melting on his hand. Like that little moment there, I was like, ooh, that's in the register or space of like what we're kind of pursuing with the filmmaking here.
Mhm. And I mean, by the same token, when you were talking to the guys about their lives in prison, uh, were there any particular anecdotes, or I don't know, a piece of research that you did, or a discovery that ended up having this kind of outsized impact on the finished work, either providing
Oh
an image?
gosh. I mean, a lot of them are directly in the movie, you know, in our scenes and moments of the movie, you know. So it was a combination of through conversation, either with the Divine I and Divine G, or with other men that we, you know, have met with on the outside or taught on the inside. So many sometimes textures or direct references or lines. But it was always done like with this really um, sort of priority around like, we are here to create a space. We found this story that you have told us quite profound and relevant to what we're making here in the movie. But this floor is yours. Like if you want this to be part of the fabric of the movie and you want to bring the story into the film, here is the moment to do it. But it was always like consent's the wrong word, but it was always like in community. We were making these decisions together because that's something that we are very sensitive and have been through this whole process of, you know, that this story belongs to the men that really lived it, and it's sort of theirs, that we are there to help curate and help shepherd it, but it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to these men, and so that was always a very delicate place that we would walk through. I mean, I can think of several moments. One in particular, one of our actors, Sean Dino Johnson, tells a story directly from his own life, when he witnessed a murder that happened right in front of him in the mess hall, and sort of felt nothing when it happened, and that really started to work on him as like, that's not what it means to be human, and this is what this space allows me for inside the theater. We're here to become human again, and that is Dino's story. And so, you know, the movie in a way was just kind of creating a stage by which that these actors could kind of narrate their own lives.
Mhm. So it's a much less sort of capital D dramatic example than that experience in the mess hall that Dino talks about. But the one of the threads that I found so moving was the way in which Divine Eye feels his way through the Hamlet soliloquy.
Mm-hmm.
Because the change in his performance over the course of the film,
Yeah.
I think, again, you know, it's like I said at the start, it's the thing that makes the film's case for it automatically, because you're not being told it, you're feeling it. I mean, is that true to life? First of all, did he perform that monologue in the play? And I'm just also intrigued about how you direct someone to become better at delivering this kind of, I mean, arguably the most famous soliloquy in all of, you know, theatre.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I'm speaking to some folks from the UK where all this really started, but I would put Clarence's performance of that soliloquy up there with the best, you know. And actually, I was just at an event where Clarence and Jude Law were getting into the intricacies of that soliloquy and how they both have played it and the choices they made. And it was just kind of a beautiful moment of like connection. But you know, that was the actual character he played in Breaking the Mummy's Code. He really did perform that soliloquy on stage in 2005. And Shakespeare really was a strong influence on what drew him into this program itself. Like something he didn't fully understand at first. It was just kind of a beacon, on a hill that was drawing him in. But then, in his words, he was like, Shakespeare's someone who takes what he could have said in just one sentence and makes a whole paragraph out of it, But within that paragraph sort of contains like multitudes, and was giving Clarence vocabulary for feelings that he couldn't name, and so the challenge for him, and he always, and for I guess within like how to figure out how to like chart someone's growth with a piece of writing like that across a movie that's also marking his own personal growth was something we had to kind of work underneath as we progressed with the process. Because in his words, he was like, "Yeah, I have to pretend I'm bad at acting early on to then get to be as good as I am, later in the movie." And that, that's actually, I think also it is quite difficult. But I think it was looking at, early in the film, not just I have stage fright, but like how is the context of the environment of this prison sort of adding a dimension to a familiar feeling of having stage fright, but giving but tapping sort of some of the visceral kind of constant survival mindset and fear that could happen like within incarceration. So, we had this sort of moment where one of his castmates walks behind him while he's delivering, and that really, really triggers him because within this environment that could be a threat to your life, and it's hard for him to shed that reactionary state and start to accept that this is actually truly a safe place. And so that was something that was found, like was a little slight on the page, but as we got into rehearsals and then as we got onto set, we started to poke at that and found that moment. And then later on, it's not really called attention to, but then that same castmate JJ walks behind him again, and he just sort of stays in the moment. And it's like, okay, we're marking that, as a piece of growth. And then right before he can really, really deliver it, and a big thing that I learned early on was like, it's hard to learn lines if you don't understand them, And so he finally had to confront and find an understanding of these lines, and that's when he starts to question like his own fate, and what Hamlet is questioning with that piece, and like, what is my own destiny here? And am I destined to sort of stay as the world perceives me to be and labels me, or can I be something more? And once that helps get unlocked through the friendship with Divine G, then we hear the full expression of that piece, and he just absolutely owns it.
You mentioned rehearsal time before the shoot there. How much did you have, and how did you use it?
It was really interesting, because the script, if you were to break it down, kind of has three pillars. You have the story between Divine I and Divine G, which is very scripted and very traditional, but we wrote it in an untraditional way. And so once we kind of started with that friendship story and brought Divine I and Divine G in, Coleman came on board very soon after. He came on board on a Zoom just like this. We had just met him. We had no script to offer because we were starting over, and no budget or anything like that. And just a story and an instinct of where we wanted to go with it. And he came on board on that first Zoom, and at the prospect of like, we can all develop this together. And so the way we rehearsed it was also how we wrote it. And so we would get on Zoom like this after Clint and I would have conversations with Divine I and Divine G. We would write a handful of scenes. Then we would get on Zoom, and Coleman and Clarence would join with us. We would share our screen and present the scenes cold, and they would read them purely on just first blush instinct and perform them to each other. And at the end, we would sort of talk about what was working, what was not working, some ideas for how to play the scene. They would read it again. And then we would talk about where the story could go from there. And then Clint and I would go away and write, and we would come back. And so we would write and rehearse at the same time. And so these performances were able to fuse to the material, and we were able to write to their performances in a really sort of elegant, natural way, so that by the time we actually got to set, it was rehearsed, and now that material was really solid, and something that we could really trust, and let that be the spine of the movie. Then the sort of next function of the script was, how do you capture the putting on a show element, the production of Mummy's Code? And that's where we wanted to loosen our grip a bit. There were several scripted moments throughout that were relevant to the plot, but then we would do a lot of like situational writing. For example, like the audition sequence of the film was a prompt that was about a paragraph long. The men auditioned for Breaking the Mummy's Code. It goes from the banal to the funny to the profound, and we start to see this range of talents and endear ourselves to them. Basically, that was kind of the prompt. So to the cast, I was like, you're going to audition for Mummy's Code again. Be as prepared or as not prepared as you want to be. Here are all the sides. Pick whatever character you want to read for. And then they would come in front of the camera, and some would be very prepared and off book. Some would be a little less prepared, but it like gave it that live wire audition energy. And the visual language was such in that scene that which was our cinematographer Pat's idea of like the sort of direct to camera, almost confessional space. And after these reads, we had this bucket of like questions that we would ask afterwards that the cast was not aware of. So why do you love acting? Roles from other productions have you played? Tell us a childhood story. What are you afraid of? Fight an imaginary gladiator, and through that, like these really magical things happened, And then the last thing I would say is there are some truly unscripted moments in the film, which were largely the exercises. So like the Imagine a Perfect Place exercise in the circle, that was literally just the prompt of the exercise from Brent, played by Paul Racy. And then every man in that circle answered in their own time and from their own sort of space within.
Can I ask about the case? So it's the warm-up exercise that happens towards the end of the film when their old friend, who's now working in the bakery, comes back in to visit.
Yeah.
Did they know that he was going to appear? Because that moment is so beautiful on screen.
Yeah.
And then again, and I love how he goes into talking about life on the outside and explaining, how tricky it is, but how incredible it is. I mean, was that an example of something that was broadly unscripted?
Yes, it was. And that was a scene, but it was actually a scene that we had originally written, but then threw out. And so we had always sort of envisioned a scene where an alumni from the outside comes back in to pump everybody up again, but then he needs the same support that he was trying to give to the group. And we wrote that for a dear actor friend of ours, who became unavailable, a few weeks before shooting. And as soon as we started thinking about casting someone else from the outside, it just was feeling a little more artificial, and and we started to worry, would it capture the same impact that it would have had with the actor we wrote it for. And very quickly we were like, oh, I think we need to cast this from within the RTA alumni field. And I just remembered this audition, because sometimes we would use that perfect place as an audition technique with the alumni. We would be on Zoom like this and would ask, the person auditioning to close their eyes and to go to this perfect place. And the man who plays that character named Nate, he opened his eyes and he was like, honestly, I just can't even imagine a perfect place right now. And he started telling essentially that story that's in the movie. It just took my breath away, and it just made me love him even that much more. And we were on set in prep, literally days out from shooting, and I gave him a call and I was like, what do you think about telling that story? Is it an important story for you to share to the world? And he was like, I'm down, and so he came onto the set and told essentially just that story, except now on camera, and to these men who helped care for him and love him when they were all inside the program together.
you mentioned earlier about the particular charge that the environment lends to the rehearsal process. And I kind of wonder how your cast felt about revisiting these places, because you actually shot on location in prisons, right? So, I mean, the kind of psychological wall to kind of break, I mean, to use a sort of a very obviously apposite image, the kind of wall that they have to kind of get through in order to find themselves back in that place must have been fairly considerable. So how did, I mean, did they have kind of misgivings about that, or did you at some point think, okay, so we have to shoot this on sets rather than on location, or maybe they were fine with it? I don't know.
No, it was something we were very sensitive of, and there was a lot of apprehension on behalf of our cast to voluntarily go back inside of a prison that once, held them. And what's unique about the locations we shot at, so we turned sort of 4 locations into our one Sing Sing, and so the exteriors of the prison that are seen in the film is the real place. We shot a day at the real Sing Sing. It's one of the more iconic prisons in the world. And then the interiors of the facility, for more of the traditional prison cell block, yard, related scenes, was a maximum security facility called Downstate that was closed 1 month before we went in. And what was unique about this place is it was one of the main sort of intake facilities. If you were going to do a long bid in New York State, you would start at Downstate and then matriculate to other prisons across the state. And so the entirety of our alumni cast had been incarcerated there at one point in their lives. And so not only is just the place itself levy a toll to anyone who goes in there, even decommissioned, to our crew too. I mean, just the walls, the miles of razor wire that kind of feel like they're choking out outside out every room that you're in from the windows, the heat. There's no air conditioning or ventilation in most prisons in the US. And it just sort of, this dead hot air just sort of sits on top of you, when you're working. The ghosts in the walls, the fact that it's a maze, like it's designed intentionally almost to be almost like a maze, that you go down one set of stairs only to go up another, to go down another set of stairs, to go out a door that you didn't know you were supposed to go through, And so within all of that, the question was, is this too much to ask, our cast? And, by and large, and this was a community discussion, was that, to these men, the purpose of the message they wanted to share, and they were very proud of this program, was greater than the discomfort, and even putting on prison greens, not alone, was actually maybe even a more triggering act, because these were things that signified you as a number and not a person, that uniformity. And Clarence, he would tell me that his body would itch, putting them back on. But then you start to realize, like, this is a costume by which to express a character, and there's sort of a unique sort of freedom that starts to emerge from that. And then also the facility itself, every step you took once in this place was governed by somebody else, and now you could move freely through it. And so this would kind of start to accumulate, but you could never really escape it. And we shot the prison-centric sort of dimension of this movie in the first half of the shoot. And just to be able to leave that behind in your rear view mirror and then go into the theater space for the rest of the shoot, I mean, those were long, rough days for everybody, particularly our cast. And then we moved into the theater, and the camera suddenly was able to move and interact more, because we moved into more handheld photography, like it was bathed in this beautiful natural light. And we had kind of like lifted off from like the place that we started from, and we just burned through pages those days. We would finish like 2-3 hours early every day. And this was an 18-day shoot, and like, no, yeah, it really was. And on that last week in the theater, we were finishing early, 2-3 hours, because of how good it felt to be doing that work after what we had came from,
Okay, there's a lot of things I want to jump and from there. But let's talk about the characters' costumes, because
Yeah.
obviously the prison greens are a uniform, if that's the right word for them. I don't know, but it's obviously it's a very, very strictly governed dress code in prison. So how did you kind of work with your costumes? Is it Deseret?
Deseret.
Yeah. How
Deseret
did
Pesta.
Deseret about how much scope was there for variation and interpretation in that, or did she just kind of have to play totally by the rules for those?
She both um, honored the rules in terms of like what is prison issue, and working from that for the authenticity of that, but also recognized, I think, something essential about that because, you know, she deserves a ton of credit and through her imagination of what she did with the Mummies Code costumes, which are fabulous. But I think a lot of the creativity that gets overlooked is how to make how to utilize these prison greens as a means of expressing personal style and individuality, as a means of like expressing a character when everyone has to wear the same thing, and so through her research, through her discussions with our alumni cast, started to discover like that, if you that these prison greens could also be a status symbol in many ways, so if you had power and money, in prison, some like Clarence Divine Eye Macklin had through much of his time before he discovered the program, he would have his screens tailored inside,
Wow. Okay.
and the sneakers that he's wearing and the jewelry he's wearing, all of these things are gestures of power, And then someone like Divine G, was, she really focused on like someone who doesn't have time to think about what he's wearing because all of his time is focused on either building, this program or fighting for his own freedom or fighting for other people's freedom through the law library. And so there's something like there's something a little mismatched about it, and maybe the pants, are a little short, or all these little dimensions, but that we could get some insight through the characters that I thought was really fascinating as she uncovered that.
And in terms of using those the costumes for the play itself, was
Yeah.
Deseret able to go from like ideas from the RTA's own costume stash, or where were those coming from?
Yeah, several of them are both from Brent Buell's like personal collection.
Oh, great. Okay.
He still had all the Hawaiian shirts from one of the scenes, but also RTA kept a collection of costumes across a lot of their productions. There were still several of the original Mummies Code costumes kept at a campus called SUNY Purchase. But a big thing that we talked about a lot, both in terms of costumes and production design, is honor the process of how these costumes and sets were procured and built, and then elevate it for the screen. So it was like that sort of distinction of, a lot of this was donated and pulled from lots of different Broadway, storerooms, across New York that volunteers would go and try to, beg and borrow and steal for. And so it kind of has like a chaos to it, even in not just the play itself of all the roles, but just where those costumes were sourced from. And yet push them a little bit further, than their original intention, and use the tools that we have within film production and our own resources to kind of expand, but not rewrite, and then even the sets, all the sets of the original Mummies Code production were actually built on site inside Sing Sing, and we didn't have access to those. We recreated them from images, that Brent had taken, and then our art department team like built them from scratch, again, elevating and pushing them a little bit further. But one kind of fascinating detail is that inside Sing Sing, the sets were built in the wood shop, which formerly was the death house at Sing Sing. And literally the outline of the electric chair is still in that building. And yet, despite that, these whimsical, magical sets are being built on that on that same foundation. I think there's something quite sad, but also rebellious and beautiful about that, the sheer act of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you've got that lovely visual half rhyme as well with the plastic sheeting that's used for
Yeah.
the waves. You know, like that to me calls to mind the little fragments of sheeting that are caught on the barbed wire that we keep seeing.
Wow.
You know, you've got the kind of the
Oh.
shreds there, and then suddenly there's this kind of beautiful letting, really elegant kind of wave. And I mean, I'm not a kind of an Amdram person at all, but that seems like quite an elaborate effect to have on a stage. But that to me felt like the kind of thing, you know, you take it and then you elevate it.
Yeah, in the original production, the waves were made by little cardboard cutouts that were painted blue that look like white caps for waves, and they just had two layers of it, and they just moved them back and forth like that to create the sensation of the waves moving. And then Ruta, our production designer, she then sort of took that instinct and then just brought something even more to it with like the power of like the undulating like plastic sheeting that was moving. It was beautiful.
Mhm. So, I mean, with this is Ruta Kiska, your production designer.
Yeah.
Am I pronouncing her surname right?
Well, yeah, that's how I used to think it was pronounced, but it's actually Kishkite. She's from Lithuania. Yeah.
So Ruta Kishkite, was she mainly kind of occupied with the stage production itself? And I mean, were the prison interiors pretty much as they were required to be, or did those need any, I don't know, adjustments?
The main focus on the prison interiors was largely driven by each of the men's cells and how that could again be a reflect. If you have to take a whole life, and fit it inside of such a confined space, how would each of these men have expressed themselves, within that environment? And so for Divine G, it was like its own library, and so much was pertained to his case, his own goals, dreams, his writing. He was also a novelist and a playwright. He wrote 13 novels while he was incarcerated across his 25 years while he was inside. So it was a workshop. It was, his own law chambers. It was many things, but alongside like photos of family. And for Divine Eye, it was more again about power and status. And so, how many cans of vegetables and loaves of bread you have is often a sign of currency, inside. And so that was more what was occupied there, alongside little like glimpses of like the sort of artistic self, like a hand-drawn, artwork of a leopard, on the wall, or, think little things like that. And then for Mike, his cell was very spare and kind of reflective of some of maybe the desperation, inside of himself. And so it was about listening and paying attention, but both Divine Eye and Divine G's cells were built to spec. So directly from their own memories, they co-designed it alongside Ruta.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to ask you as well. I mean, this is going quite a bit. You mentioned Pat Scola's work as cinematographer.
Yeah.
What have you previously seen that he had shot, and what were your early discussions with him about the film's texture? Because it has such a specific texture. And I mean, we mentioned the close-ups right at the very start, but this kind of approach to close-up. What were your kind of early discussions like? Shall we try this? Should we do this?
I'd seen several of his features just as a fan, from Pig to Monsters and Men to Southside with You. But honestly, it was a lot of his like music video work where, it was very like on the move, like instinctual work, but wildly creative, that really caught my attention. But the main thing that made me want to work with him was we had kind of met while we were trying to put together a previous project that ended up falling apart. But I think it was kind of destiny, because I don't know that we were meant to work on that one together. This was the one we were supposed to make, that we were kind of born to make. And I remember one of our first conversations about it was like, it's crazy you're telling me about this, because I was sent a script years ago about a prison theater program, but it was all a guise to like actually escape the prison. And I remember telling the producers, actually, what if you just did a film about the program itself? And then now we were coming with a project that was just that. But that, of course, like his the there is a sort of a stunning poetic beauty to his work, but I'm really most attracted to his mind and his story mind in the way that I felt honestly like while we were working together that he was almost writing the script with us at the same time, just without a pen, as he was like sort of drilling into and pressure testing moments and ideas and kind of getting to the very root of it. But a lot of our early conversations were built around a common concern that the question was like, how could we achieve scale and scope in such a confined space? My first film was a movie called Transpecos. It was set in a desert, and you could literally point the camera in any direction and have this sort of endless horizon. And now we were sort of telling a story inside walls, inside cells, and how could it feel grand? And I think the main realization that we came to early on was like, oh, this is a movie about the landscape of the human face. It's about the stories a face tells it. And if you draw close to it, a face contains an endless horizon as well. And so once we cracked that, we sort of built a visual framework around sort of a progression of drawing closer and closer and closer to someone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on that note, I want to go to a question that's been submitted by David. Thank you very much for this, David, who asks about one of the professional, I mean, quote unquote professional actors. We can discuss this in a second. But yes, so he says he was surprised to see that Brett in the film wasn't played by Brett. Paul Rassi's performance feels so raw and naturalistic. How did you work with him to ensure that his performance worked so seamlessly with the rest of the cast?
That's a great question. And what was unique about, because casting Brent is a tricky thing with a story like this, because we've seen lots of movies where the teacher comes in and does good, and the focus on the story was from within the program on these two men and their lives and their friendship. And yet Brent is very essential to this movie at the same time. And so how do you reconcile that and create a performance that adds tremendous meaning to the movie, but doesn't pull all the attention to itself, and the casting is really kind of like a core element of capturing that. Because if you cast the wrong person, again, just even their presence in a scene pulls all the attention to them. And Paul is a very unique person in that he feels so of the world while also so strong in his craft. And he's got such a deep, immense warmth that emanates from him. He's a really beautiful person. And his process, because he came on very late, like a week before starting to shoot. And so he just sort of threw himself right off the cliff, right into the creative process of making this film. And he really relied on the real Brent, who not only, wrote this play Breaking the Mummy's Code and was so involved in the development process, but was a co-producer and was on set the entire shoot. And so they would be huddling off set, and Paul would also just be watching Brent's real relationship with many of the alumni and just sort of studying that and sort of channeling that into his own performance, which is different than, Coleman's approach, where he really needed some separation and distance from the real Divine G so that he could sort of build his own character that taps the spirit of the real Divine G, but is also kind of a creation. And so it's just kind of finding out and listening to your actors and what their process is and how do you best be in support of that and help it harmonize into the process of the rest of the actors.
Mm-hmm. So going back to this term I used, non-professional. Now clearly these guys
right.
with the RTA program, they are actors, but they presumably be more acclimatized to theatre, live performance. So what skills did they already have in place that you were able to kind of just parlay straight into making Sing Sing? And were there other kind of aspects of the performance that had to be kind of, I don't know, created or adjusted in some way to kind of to performing for the camera specifically?
It's a great question. There is there's the technical element of it, which is just the training that many of these men have had on stage for sometimes decades, that happens to be also within the exact same setting of the movie we're making, and everything that comes with that, of not only how does this program function, uh, but what does it feel like and have to have come through this program, and also all of the myriad of experiences of incarceration. All of that can be brought to bear, brought into the process. That is a priceless thing that not only were they able to bring to their performances, but they were able to inform literally every department on the movie, on that we all learned from essentially having 13 subject matter experts on set at all times with us, you know. But then the gap really is from stage to camera. And I think Clarence sort of puts it best when he was talking about, like, when he was trained to project to the last row, that the person in the very last seat of the theater can hear every enunciation and and witness sort of every expression. And the challenge with film is like, and this was something that Coleman helped teach him, was to bring all of that into the size of that lens box, you know, like that's what you're performing to now. And with that, you know, all of the subtlety that can be communicated, the things that you can pull from within, the things you can do in silence, you know, speaks very loudly. And so I think that was one of the big transitions. But one of the best things about our cast was just how accessible every performer was at the soul level. It's a sensation that you don't fully understand until you're in the presence of it, which I think now people seeing the film are, but even just being in the room when it happens, it's just different. And there's also a level of, like, it's not naivete, but it's an enthusiasm that everyone in our cast that was alumni acting in their first film, there was a joy of, like, we get to make a movie, you know? And that was infectious to all of us, like, jaded, you know, jaded, you know, exhausted, you know, filmmakers coming from the outside. Like, it awakened our love of how we remembered when we first were on our first set.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to ask you about we're slightly coming up on time here, I think, but I want to quickly ask you about Coleman's performance, because I think one of the things I love about it so much is the tension between the pain that his character has at having to cede the stage to Divine Eye, and to kind of, you know, not be in charge of this group anymore, and kind of, you know, and you know, be aware that this guy needs to have a chance to play Hamlet himself. That's difficult. But Coleman as an actor is so incredibly good at ceding space on screen to other actors, and just, you know, and just even like listening, or just being present when someone else is doing something. And somehow there's something going on there, some weird transference where his presence changes the other player's performance. So I'm really interested. Tell me about, you know, getting him to work with the guys from the program, and how he was, I don't know, if he was able to draw other things out of them that they were perhaps not. You know, they needed someone like Coleman in the room, on set, in the scene with them to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, because I don't think it gets talked about enough of how Coleman was someone who could have come in and just bulldozed his way through this movie, and, you know, kind of truly owned the room, you know, and kind of overpowered the rest of these performances. You know, he has that level of talent. He could have done that. But I think the real mastery of the performance is how he can both command a scene and the generosity to ensure people around him can shine, is really part of the special aspect of this movie, you know, and what he does within it. And I think the thing to give credit where it's due to the alumni and to Clarence Macklin and everyone else, that accessible at the soul level is equally, it's sort of magical to witness, but it also creates an expectation that the scene partners do the same, you know? And so And so Coleman, I think, in turn and in that exchange, brought himself down to a level of rawness and exposed sort of deeper aspects of his being that he has never brought into a space on a set or a stage in his life, you know. And I think that's part of what elevates it to the performance of a lifetime is that dynamic, and you know, both what he gave and what was expected of him in a space like this.
Mm-hmm. We are almost on time. I want to quickly ask one last thing, which is this the thick envelope versus the thin envelope. I love that scene, that idea is kind of planted in the screenplay, and then 3 times you get this amazing emotional payoff from it. And it's so beautifully done. I'm assuming that's a true thing. The guys, they know to look out for the envelope. But tell us just about, you know, using that as like such a great screenwriting device.
Yeah, I mean, first when Clint and I heard that that it kind of also goes against expectation that you know, thick would, you know, when you get accepted to college, thick means you're in, you know. And thin means like you're rejected or something, you know, similar to like film festivals or whatever. But there was something like felt significant about that. And then Clint, I remember he wrote that bit of dialogue, and there's this elegance to it of like, thick as a brick, you know, you're keeping your ass here, light as a feather, you're free, you know. And it's so, it feels like something like in passing, like that's kind of a bit of a throwaway, but it sort of plants a seed there that then when you really see it, you know, when that thick envelope drops like lead, and then, you know, Coleman is holding his hands, it says everything. And then to step into the next scene and to see that Clarence, we know he's going home again by just how thin that is. And we think that sort of like ties up this motif. And then all this time later, you know, when Coleman's finally going home, just the way he holds that in his hands, the way that was totally a performance thing. Like he had it in his hands, and the way he just like brought it up to his forehead, you know, and tapped it so that it would read and convey like at long last, you know, because from the time of his clemency hearing getting denied to when he actually went home in real life, that was 7 years. He had to wait 7 more years before he finally held that envelope himself, you know. And so again, he's harnessing that. He's aware of the space between, and he's able to convey without superimposing 7 years later. We know it costs something to finally hold that in his hands.
Well, that is a perfect place to stop tonight's conversation. Greg, thank you so much for your time, and congratulations again on the film.
Thank you.
This podcast was recorded at a Directors UK member event. You can hear plenty more directors in conversation by subscribing on the usual streaming platforms. Follow us on social media and find out more about us at directors.uk.com.